This is my true story. I worked as a janitor for 30 years, mopping floors and cleaning toilets in the biggest office building downtown, and my family was so ashamed of me, they stopped inviting me to gatherings and moved across town to distance themselves from the grandfather who embarrassed them. My daughter said I smelled like bleach. My son-in-law called me the help. My 12-year-old grandson refused to let me pick him up from school because his friends laughed at the janitor. But one Saturday, my grandson followed me to work and discovered something that destroyed his entire world. But you won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. For 30 years, I put on the same navy blue janitor uniform every single morning, the kind with my name embroidered on the chest pocket. And I drove my old pickup truck to the biggest office building in downtown to start my shift at 5 o'clock in the morning before most people were even awake. I mopped floors that stretched across 20 stories of office space, scrubbed toilets in bathrooms used by hundreds of employees and visitors every day, emptied trash bins filled with the discarded waste of lawyers and accountants and business executives who made more money in a week than most janitors made in a year. I did this work with pride and dedication, never complained about getting up before dawn, never acted like the work was beneath me or something to be ashamed of. My family thought I was just a poor cleaner barely making enough money to survive, living paycheck to paycheck like so many working-class people who do the jobs that keep society functioning but get no respect or recognition for their labor. They assumed I struggled financially because janitors don't make much money, that I lived in my small house and drove my old truck because that was all I could afford on a custodian's salary. I let them believe this story, never corrected their assumptions, never told them the truth about my financial situation, or explained that there was much more to my life than what they saw on the surface. I would come home smelling like cleaning chemicals and sweat, my uniform stained with the evidence of a day spent doing physical labor that most people would consider menial or degrading. I ate simple meals, wore simple clothes outside of work, lived a modest lifestyle that reinforced my family's belief that I was just a poor working man without much to show for decades of labor. I never bought expensive things or took fancy vacations or displayed any signs of wealth that might make them question their assumptions about my financial status. And I did this deliberately because I was testing something important about the people I loved. The work itself was honest and necessary, the kind of labor that keeps buildings functional and sanitary, but that people look down on because it involves cleaning up other people's messes. I took pride in doing my job well, in making sure every floor was spotless and every bathroom was clean, in being reliable and punctual and professional, even though most of the office workers who passed me in the hallways barely acknowledged my existence. To them, I was just part of the building's infrastructure, as invisible and unremarkable as the plumbing or the electrical system, someone who existed to serve their needs, but who didn't warrant attention or respect as a human being with dignity and worth. I had started this janitor job 40 years ago when I first bought the building, back when downtown real estate was cheap and smart investors could acquire valuable properties for reasonable prices if they had the vision to see potential where others saw decay. I had made my fortune in real estate over the decades, buying buildings when they were undervalued and holding them as the city grew and property values increased, accumulating a portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars through patient strategic investing and good timing. But I never stopped working as a janitor in my own building, never hired someone else to do the cleaning, never revealed to anyone, including my family, that the humble custodian mopping floors at 5 a.m. was actually the owner of everything they saw. I wore that janitor uniform as a test, as a way to see who would love me for who I was, rather than for what I could give them, as a method of determining whether my family valued me as a person or only valued the financial benefits I might provide. I wanted to know if my daughter would still want me in her life when she thought I was poor. If my grandson would still be proud to have me as his grandfather when he believed I cleaned toilets for a living. If my family's love was conditional on my perceived social status and wealth. For 30 years I conducted this experiment, watching carefully how they treated me when they thought I had nothing, and the results broke my heart in ways I never expected when I started this test decades ago. My daughter stopped inviting me to family gatherings about 10 years ago, started making excuses about why I couldn't come to birthday parties or holiday dinners, or any of the events where her friends and her husband's colleagues would be present. She said I smelled like bleach and cleaning chemicals even after I showered and changed into clean clothes, claimed the odor was embedded in my skin and hair in ways that washing couldn't remove, told me it was embarrassing to have me around people from her social circle who would judge her for having a father who worked as a janitor. She said this to my face without any apparent shame or recognition of how cruel it was to exclude your own father from family events because you were embarrassed by his honest work. Her husband, my son-in-law, was even worse in the way he treated me and talked about my occupation whenever we were together. He called me the help, even in my own home when he came to visit, made jokes about me being good at cleaning up messes since that was my job, asked me loudly at dinner tables whether I had scrubbed any good toilets lately, while his friends laughed at his cruel humor. He worked in finance and made good money and wore expensive suits, and he clearly viewed my janitorial work as evidence that I was beneath him in status and worth, that his professional white-collar job made him superior to the old man who mopped floors for a living. I sat through his mockery in silence, watching my daughter laugh along with her husband's jokes, saying nothing because I was curious to see how far their cruelty would go. They moved across town to a more expensive neighborhood about 5 years ago. Bought a large house in a community where professionals and business owners lived, and they were very clear with me that the move was partly about distancing themselves from me. My daughter said they wanted a fresh start in an area where nobody knew their backgrounds, where she wouldn't have to explain that her father was a janitor, where she could create a new identity as someone from a successful family without the embarrassment of having working-class parents. She actually used those words, said I was an embarrassment, said having me around reminded her of a background she wanted to forget, said it was easier to just create some distance and see me less frequently. The invitations to visit became rare, and then stopped completely, and when I would call to ask about coming over to see my grandson, my daughter would make excuses about them being busy or having other plans. She stopped answering my calls as frequently, started communicating mainly through brief text messages that felt cold and obligatory. Made it very clear through her behavior that I was not welcome in her life anymore unless absolutely necessary. My son-in-law blocked my number at one point after I called too many times trying to reach my daughter, and she didn't unblock me for 2 months until I showed up at their house unannounced and demanded to know why they were cutting me out of the family. She told me then, with brutal honesty, that having a janitor grandfather didn't fit the image they were trying to project in their new neighborhood, that her friends were doctors and lawyers and business executives whose parents were also successful professionals, that I was the only working-class person in their social circle, and it made them uncomfortable. She said her son, my 12-year-old grandson, was at an age where appearances mattered, and having a grandfather who cleaned toilets was affecting his social status at school. She asked me to understand that this wasn't personal, that they still loved me, but that they needed some space to establish themselves in their new community without the complication of explaining my occupation to people who wouldn't understand. I left their house that day understanding very clearly that my family was ashamed of me, that they valued social status and appearance more than they valued their relationship with me, that the janitor uniform I wore to work every morning made me unacceptable in their eyes despite decades of being a good father and grandfather. I drove home in my old pickup truck thinking about the test I had been conducting for 30 years and realizing I already had my answer about whether my family loved me for who I was or only valued me for what I could provide. My 12-year-old grandson used to love when I picked him up from school, would run to my truck with excitement and tell me about his day and show me his homework and his test scores. But that changed completely when he started middle school and became more aware of social hierarchies and what his friends thought about him. He stopped wanting me to pick him up, started insisting that his mother had to be the one to get him from school, and when I asked him why he looked uncomfortable and said his friends made fun of him when they saw me arrive in my janitor uniform, he said the other kids asked why his grandfather was dressed like a cleaning person, said they laughed and called him poor, said it was embarrassing to have a janitor pick him up when everyone else's grandparents drove nice cars and wore nice clothes. I tried to explain to him that there was nothing shameful about honest work, that janitors and other service workers were essential people who deserved respect rather than mockery, that a person's worth wasn't determined by their occupation or how much money they made. But he was 12 years old and desperate to fit in with his peers, and my words meant nothing compared to the social pressure he felt from classmates who judged him based on his grandfather's appearance. He begged me to stop coming to his school, said I was ruining his reputation, said the other kids thought he was poor because of me, and eventually I agreed to stop picking him up because I didn't want to cause him more distress, even though his shame cut me deeply. The situation got worse over the following year, as my grandson became increasingly hostile about my occupation and what it meant for his social standing. He refused to tell his friends what I did for a living, made up stories about me being retired or sick or living far away, anything to avoid admitting that his grandfather cleaned toilets for a living. When I would visit their house, he would hide in his room, wouldn't come out to talk to me, acted like my presence was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. His parents encouraged this behavior, never corrected him when he was rude to me, seemed to agree that my job was something shameful that deserved to be hidden rather than acknowledged. One day when I came to visit, my grandson was having friends over, and when I walked into the house wearing my work uniform because I had come straight from my shift, he looked at me with pure horror and embarrassment. His friends saw me and asked who I was, and my grandson said I was just someone who worked in the building where his mother had an appointment, claimed he didn't know me, pretended I was a stranger rather than his grandfather. I stood there watching my own grandson deny our relationship because he was ashamed to admit we were related, and I said nothing because I wanted to see how far his shame would take him. Later that evening, after his friends left, my daughter called me angry that I had shown up in my work clothes when she had told me her son was having people over. She said I had embarrassed her son, made him look bad in front of his friends, created a situation that would take weeks to repair in terms of his social standing. Then my grandson came to the phone and for the first time said directly what he had been feeling for months. He screamed at me asking why couldn't I be normal like other grandpas? Why did I have to clean toilets for a living? Why couldn't I have a respectable job that he could tell people about without being laughed at? He said every other kid at his school had grandparents who were doctors or lawyers or business owners, or at least retired from decent careers. And he was stuck with a grandfather who mopped floors and scrubbed toilets and wore a janitor uniform with his name on it like some kind of servant. He said I was ruining his life by existing in this form, that he wished I would just disappear or at least pretend to be something other than what I was. I listened to every word, felt each one like a knife, and I knew then that my test had revealed the truth about my family's love. What none of them knew, what I had carefully hidden from my family for over 30 years, was that I didn't just work in that building as an employee doing janitorial services for someone else. I actually owned the entire building and had owned it since I purchased it 40 years ago, when downtown real estate was cheap and investors with vision could buy valuable properties at prices that seem impossible now. I had bought that 20-story office building for less than $2 million back when the downtown area was struggling and most investors were fleeing to the suburbs, and I had held on to it while the city grew and property values increased until that single building was now worth over $15 million all by itself. But that building was just one piece of my real estate portfolio that I had built over 4 decades of strategic investing and patient accumulation of properties in areas I believed would increase in value over time. I owned 6 other commercial buildings in different parts of the city, owned apartment complexes and retail spaces and land that I had purchased when prices were low and held until the market recognized their value. My total net worth was approximately $47 million, built entirely through real estate investments and careful management of properties that generated rental income and appreciated significantly over the years I held them. I had started with almost nothing when I was young, had worked construction jobs and saved every penny I could, had learned about real estate by reading books and talking to investors and studying the market until I understood how to identify undervalued properties. My first purchase was a small apartment building that I bought with a loan I could barely afford, and I lived in one unit while renting out the others to cover my mortgage and generate small profit. That first building taught me everything I needed to know about property management and tenant relations and building maintenance, and it gave me the foundation to grow my portfolio from one property to dozens over the following decades. When I bought the downtown office building 40 years ago, I decided to work there as a janitor rather than hiring someone else to do the cleaning, partly to save money in those early years when cash flow was tight and every dollar mattered, but mainly because I wanted to stay connected to the physical reality of property ownership rather than becoming a detached landlord who never saw his buildings or understood what maintaining them actually required. I found I enjoyed the work, liked the quiet early morning hours when the building was empty, took pride in keeping the property clean and well maintained, and I saw no reason to stop doing the job just because I could afford to hire someone else. Over the years, as my wealth grew and my portfolio expanded, I continued wearing the janitor uniform and mopping floors and cleaning toilets while secretly being the owner of everything around me. I never told my family about my real estate investments or my actual net worth, never showed them bank statements or property deeds or any evidence that I was anything other than a working-class janitor struggling to get by on a modest income. This wasn't about being secretive for the sake of secrecy or playing games with my family for entertainment. It was a deliberate test to see who would love me for who I was, rather than for what I could give them. I had seen too many wealthy people whose families and friends only valued them for their money, who were surrounded by people seeking handouts and favors and inheritance rather than genuine relationships. I wanted to know if my daughter would still want me in her life when she thought I was poor, if my grandson would still love his grandfather when he believed I had nothing to offer except my time and affection, if my family's love was real or conditional on financial benefit. So I wore my janitor uniform and let them think I was struggling, watched carefully how they treated me when they believed I had nothing, and learned a devastating truth about the people I loved most in the world. One Saturday morning, my 12-year-old grandson apparently decided he had had enough of being embarrassed by his janitor grandfather and hatched a plan that he thought would give him ammunition to use against me, or perhaps proof to show his friends that his grandfather was everything they mocked him for being. He told his mother he was going to a friend's house to work on a school project, left home early with his phone fully charged and ready to record video, and secretly followed me as I drove my old pickup truck from my house to the downtown office building where I worked. He must have taken the bus or gotten dropped off nearby, must have waited outside watching for me to arrive, must have been planning to film me doing janitorial work so he could show his friends or use it somehow to process his own shame about our relationship. He watched from across the street as I parked my truck in the employee lot at 5:15 in the morning, watched me get out wearing my navy blue janitor uniform with my name embroidered on the pocket, watched me grab my equipment from the truck bed, including my mop and bucket and cleaning supplies. He must have felt vindicated in that moment, must have thought this video footage of his grandfather arriving to clean toilets would somehow prove something, or give him closure, or justify his embarrassment. He followed me into the building, staying far enough back that I wouldn't notice him, probably hiding behind pillars and doorways, like he was conducting some kind of surveillance operation. He watched me walk through the main lobby with my mop and bucket, heading toward what appeared to be the janitor's closet where cleaning supplies were stored, and he probably had his phone out ready to record me beginning my humiliating work cleaning floors and bathrooms. But then something happened that he wasn't expecting, something that didn't fit the narrative he had constructed about his poor working-class grandfather who embarrassed him with his lowly occupation. Instead of entering the janitor's closet and beginning to clean, I walked right past it without stopping, continued through the lobby toward the bank of elevators, pressed the button and waited for the doors to open. My grandson must have been confused, must have wondered where I was going with my cleaning equipment, must have assumed I was heading to one of the office floors to begin janitorial work there. He followed me into the elevator, keeping his distance, standing in the back corner while I stood near the front, and he watched me press the button for the 20th floor, the top floor of the building where the executive offices and penthouse suites were located. The elevator rose in silence, my grandson probably holding his breath, probably wondering what kind of important offices his grandfather was trusted to clean that he needed to go all the way to the top floor. The elevator doors opened on the 20th floor, and I stepped out into the hallway, but instead of heading toward a supply closet or beginning to mop floors, I walked directly to the large wooden double doors at the end of the hall. These were impressive doors, the kind that clearly led to an important office, and above them was a brass nameplate that my grandson could see even from his position near the elevators. The nameplate read in clear letters that couldn't be mistaken or misread, "Building Owner," and below that was my full name engraved in brass that had been polished to a shine. My grandson must have stopped breathing in that moment, must have felt his entire understanding of reality shift beneath his feet, must have stood frozen trying to process what he was seeing. His grandfather, the janitor he was ashamed of, the man who cleaned toilets and mopped floors and embarrassed him at school, was walking into an office labeled Building Owner with his name on the door. He watched me unlock those doors with a key from my pocket, watched me step inside, watched me disappear into what was clearly not a janitor's closet, but an executive office at the top of the building. He stood in that hallway for several minutes trying to make sense of what he had witnessed, and then his curiosity and confusion overwhelmed his caution, and he walked toward those doors and knocked. I opened the door to find my 12-year-old grandson standing in the hallway looking pale and confused, his phone clutched in his hand, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear or disbelief. He asked me what I was doing here in this office, why my name was on the door, whether I was delivering something or doing cleaning work for whoever owned this building. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come inside, and he walked into my office slowly, like he was entering some kind of alternate reality that didn't match anything he thought he knew about his grandfather. The office was large and well-appointed with expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire downtown area, with framed property deeds on the walls and photos of buildings I owned throughout the city. I sat down at my desk and invited him to sit in one of the leather chairs across from me, and I watched his eyes scan the room, taking in every detail that contradicted his understanding of who I was and what I did for a living. He asked again whose office this was, and I told him very simply that it was mine, that I owned this building and had owned it for 40 years, that the janitor uniform I wore every morning was something I chose to wear while working in my own property. I opened drawers in my desk and pulled out property deeds showing my ownership of this building and 6 others throughout the city, pulled out bank statements showing account balances that added up to millions of dollars, pulled out portfolio summaries documenting my $47 million net worth accumulated through decades of real estate investment. My grandson's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information. Shock giving way to confusion, giving way to something like horror as he realized what this meant about everything he had believed and everything he had said and done regarding his grandfather over the past year. He asked me in a whisper why I pretended to be a janitor if I owned the building, why I let everyone think I was poor, why I never told anyone about my money or my properties. I looked at him very seriously and told him the truth I had been waiting years to reveal. Told him I wore that janitor uniform and did that work to see which members of my family would love me for who I was rather than for what I could give them. I explained that I had conducted this test for 3 decades, living modestly and working as a janitor while secretly being wealthy, watching carefully how my family treated me when they believed I had nothing to offer except my love and my time. I told him I had learned everything I needed to know about who they really were and what they really valued. Learned that my daughter was ashamed of me and excluded me from her life because she thought I was embarrassing. Learned that my son-in-law mocked me and called me the help because he thought I was beneath him. Learned that my grandson was so ashamed of me that he denied our relationship in front of his friends and screamed at me for cleaning toilets for a living. His face crumpled as he heard these words, as he understood that I had known about his shame all along, that I had been aware of every cruel thing he said and every time he rejected me and every moment he wished I was someone different. He started to cry, tears running down his 12-year-old face, and he tried to apologize, but I held up my hand to stop him. I told him I had something I needed to show him, something I had prepared specifically for this moment when the truth would finally be revealed and my family would understand what they had done and what they had lost through their cruelty and their obsession with social status. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, a legal document that I had updated just the week before, and I handed it to my grandson and told him to open it and read what was inside. His hands were shaking as he tore open the envelope and pulled out the pages within, and I watched his eyes move across the words as he read my last will and testament that would determine what happened to my $47 million fortune after I died. My grandson's hands trembled as he unfolded the legal documents and began reading my will, his eyes scanning the formal language that lawyers use to describe how a person's assets will be distributed after their death. The document was comprehensive and detailed, listing every property I owned, every bank account, every investment, the complete inventory of my $47 million estate that I had spent 4 decades building through careful investing and strategic property management. I watched his face as he read through the list of assets, watched him realize just how wealthy his janitor grandfather actually was, watched his expression change from shock to something like hope as he probably assumed that all this money would be coming to his family eventually. But then he reached the section of the will that detailed the actual distribution of my estate, the part that explained who would receive what after I died. And I watched the hope drain from his face as he read words that I had carefully chosen and reviewed multiple times to make sure they expressed exactly what I wanted. The will stated very clearly that my daughter would receive $0 from my estate, that her husband would receive $0, that my grandson would receive $0, that none of them would inherit even a single piece of property or a single penny from the fortune I had accumulated. I had listed them by name and specifically excluded them from any benefit, making it legally clear that their exclusion was intentional rather than an oversight. The will explained my reasoning in language that was both formal and brutally honest, stating that I had tested my family's love by living modestly and working as a janitor while secretly being wealthy, and that they had failed that test completely by being ashamed of me and excluding me from their lives because they thought I was poor and embarrassing. I had documented their cruelty in the will itself, describing how my daughter stopped inviting me to family gatherings because I smelled like bleach, how my son-in-law called me the help and mocked my work, how my grandson screamed at me for cleaning toilets and was ashamed to acknowledge our relationship in front of his friends. The will stated that people who were ashamed of honest work and who valued social status more than family relationships did not deserve to benefit from wealth that had been built through exactly the kind of humble labor they despised. My grandson read these words with tears streaming down his face, read his own actions described in legal language that made them sound even more cruel than they had felt in the moment. The document continued by explaining exactly where my $47 million would go instead of to my family, describing the charitable organizations and scholarship funds that would receive everything I had worked my entire life to accumulate. I had established a foundation that would provide college scholarships specifically for children of janitors and service workers and other people who did the essential labor that kept society functioning but received little respect or recognition. The entire $47 million estate would fund this foundation in perpetuity, generating enough investment income to send hundreds of young people to college over the coming decades, giving opportunities to families who might not otherwise be able to afford higher education. The will specified that scholarship recipients should come from working-class backgrounds, should have parents employed in service industries, should be people who understood the value of honest work and would never look down on anyone for the job they held. My grandson finished reading and looked up at me with a face that was wet with tears and pale with shock, and he asked me in a broken voice whether this was real. Whether I really meant to give away $47 million to strangers instead of to my own family. I told him very calmly that yes, this was real, that I had updated this will just last week after years of watching how my family treated me, that every word was exactly what I intended and what I believed my family deserved after treating their janitor grandfather like garbage for the crime of doing honest work that embarrassed them. My grandson collapsed into the chair across from my desk, his whole body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep inside him, the kind of crying that happens when a child realizes they have done something terrible that cannot be undone. He kept saying he was sorry over and over again, his voice breaking on the words, telling me he didn't mean the things he said, that he was just a stupid kid who didn't understand what he was doing, that he would do anything to take it back if he could. He begged me to change the will, to give him another chance, to let him prove that he could love me properly now that he knew the truth about who I was and what I was worth. But I had heard him laugh at me too many times, had watched him hide from me when his friends were around, had listened to him scream that he wished I wasn't his grandfather because I cleaned toilets for a living. I had heard his mother, my own daughter, tell me I was embarrassing and that I didn't fit the image she wanted to project in her neighborhood. I had endured years of mockery from my son-in-law, who called me the help and made jokes about my occupation at family dinners when he bothered to let me attend. These weren't mistakes or misunderstandings or things said in a moment of anger that could be forgiven and forgotten. These were patterns of behavior that revealed who these people truly were and what they actually valued. My grandson tried to explain that he was only 12 years old, that kids his age were cruel and obsessed with fitting in, that he couldn't be held responsible for caring too much about what his friends thought. He said middle school was hard and social pressure was intense, and he was just trying to survive in an environment where being different or having anything unusual about your family made you a target for bullying. He said he loved me really, that underneath all the shame and embarrassment he did care about his grandfather, that if I would just give him time, he could prove it by treating me better from now on. I listened to all of this and felt nothing but sadness for what might have been if my family had been different people, if they had valued character and integrity over social status and appearance. I told my grandson that yes, he was only 12 years old, but 12 was old enough to understand basic concepts of loyalty and respect and not being ashamed of the people who loved you. I told him his age didn't excuse denying our relationship in front of his friends, didn't excuse screaming at me for having a job he considered beneath him, didn't excuse the cruelty he had shown to his grandfather who had never done anything but love him and want to be part of his life. I pointed out that his mother and father were adults who had no excuse of youth or peer pressure for their behavior, that they had deliberately excluded me from their lives because they were ashamed to have a janitor in the family, that they had moved across town specifically to distance themselves from me. I said the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, that my grandson had learned his values from parents who taught him that a person's worth was determined by their occupation and their income rather than by their character and how they treated other people. He had absorbed their belief that being seen with a janitor was shameful, that honest work was something to hide rather than respect, that social status mattered more than family relationships. My grandson cried harder as I spoke these truths, his whole body heaving with sobs, and he asked what he could do to fix this, what he could possibly say or do to make me change my mind about the will and about cutting them out of my life and my fortune. I told him very quietly that some things cannot be fixed, that you can't unsay cruel words or undo years of rejection and shame, that the damage was done and the test was over and the results were final. His family had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I was poor, and now that they knew I was wealthy, their sudden change of heart meant nothing because I understood their love was conditional on my bank account rather than real. I called my daughter and my son-in-law the next day and told them I needed to meet with them at my office to discuss something important, giving them the address of the downtown building and the floor number without explaining what this was about or why their father was asking them to come to an office building. They probably assumed I needed to talk about family matters or perhaps ask them for something, had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong or different from the usual dynamic where they controlled our relationship and decided when and how often they would tolerate my presence. They agreed to come that afternoon, probably annoyed at the inconvenience, but willing to humor their janitor father for an hour or so. I watched from my office window as they arrived in their expensive car, parked in the visitor lot, and walked into the building looking around at the impressive lobby with its marble floors and modern design. They took the elevator to the 20th floor, and when the doors opened, they saw the hallway with its expensive artwork and the wooden double doors at the end with the brass nameplate above them. I imagine they were confused as they walked down that hallway, probably wondering what their father was doing in this obviously high-end office space, perhaps assuming I had a meeting here, or was delivering something or had some reason to be in this building that fit their understanding of me as a working-class janitor. When they reached my office doors and saw the nameplate that read Building Owner followed by my full name, they stopped walking and stood there staring at the brass letters trying to make sense of what they were seeing. My daughter knocked hesitantly on the door, and I called for them to enter, and they walked into my office with expressions of complete bewilderment as they took in the large space and expensive furnishings and the spectacular views of downtown. They asked what I was doing here, why my name was on the door, whether I was meeting someone important and needed them present for some reason they couldn't understand. I invited them to sit down and told them very simply that this was my office, that I owned this building and had owned it for 40 years, that the janitor they were so ashamed of was actually a multi-millionaire real estate investor who had been testing them all along. Their jaws literally dropped open as they processed this information, and I watched them go through the same sequence of emotions my grandson had experienced the day before, shock and confusion giving way to a kind of desperate hope as they realized what this meant about their financial future. My daughter found her voice first and started yelling at me, her shock transforming instantly into anger and accusation rather than apology or shame. She screamed that I could have helped them over the years, could have made their lives easier, could have given them money for their house and their lifestyle and their son's education, instead of making them struggle and work and worry about finances. She said it was cruel of me to watch them stress about money when I had millions of dollars I could have shared, said I was selfish for living modestly and working as a janitor when I could have been supporting my family and making their lives more comfortable. I sat behind my desk listening to my daughter blame me for her financial struggles, listening to her explain why I owed her access to my wealth, listening to her reveal even more clearly than before that she had never loved me for who I was, but only for what I could potentially provide. My son-in-law joined in saying I had deceived them, that I had essentially lied by not revealing my true financial status, that they had a right to know their father-in-law was wealthy so they could plan their lives accordingly. Neither of them apologized for being ashamed of me, for excluding me from family gatherings, for teaching their son to be embarrassed by his grandfather. I responded very calmly that I had been testing whether they would love me when they thought I had nothing, and I told them they had failed that test spectacularly by being ashamed of honest work and excluding me from their lives because they thought I was embarrassing and poor. I still work as a janitor in my own building, still put on that navy blue uniform at 5 o'clock every morning and mop floors and clean bathrooms and take pride in doing honest work that keeps the property in good condition. Nothing has changed about my daily routine, despite my grandson discovering the truth and my daughter and son-in-law learning that the father they were ashamed of was actually worth $47 million. I continue living modestly in my small house, driving my old pickup truck, maintaining the same lifestyle I have had for decades because my identity was never tied to displays of wealth or social status. The janitor uniform represents something important to me about dignity and work ethic and staying connected to reality rather than becoming disconnected and entitled the way wealthy people sometimes do. My family has completely changed their behavior toward me now that they know about my money, suddenly remembering that they love me and want me in their lives and value our relationship. My daughter calls me every day now, invites me to family gatherings constantly, tells me how much they have missed having me around and how wrong they were to exclude me from their lives. My son-in-law has stopped calling me the help, now addresses me respectfully and asks for my advice about investments and business decisions, as if I am suddenly wise and worth listening to now that he knows I am wealthy. My grandson wants to spend time with me constantly, brings his friends around to meet his grandfather who owns buildings downtown, proudly tells people about my real estate portfolio as if he wasn't screaming at me 6 months ago about being embarrassed by my occupation. But the will stays unchanged, every word remaining exactly as I wrote it before they knew the truth. My $47 million estate still designated entirely for scholarships for children of janitors and service workers who will benefit from educational opportunities their parents might not otherwise be able to provide. My lawyer has the document securely filed with instructions that it cannot be changed without multiple witnesses and safeguards to prevent anyone from pressuring me or forging my signature to alter the distribution of my assets. My family knows the will exists now, knows they have been excluded, knows that all their sudden affection and interest in our relationship will not result in them inheriting anything when I die. They beg me regularly to reconsider, to give them another chance, to change the will to include them even partially in my estate. My daughter cries and says she has learned her lesson, that she understands now how wrong she was to be ashamed of honest work, that she will spend the rest of her life proving she loves me for who I am rather than what I have. My son-in-law apologizes for calling me the help, says he was ignorant and disrespectful and didn't understand the value of the work I did or the character it represented. My grandson writes me letters expressing his regret and his love, promising that he will never again be ashamed of his grandfather, regardless of what job I hold or how I choose to live my life. But I have seen who they really are when they thought I had nothing to offer them, have experienced their cruelty and their shame and their willingness to exclude me from their lives because I didn't fit their image of success. Their sudden change of heart came only after they discovered my wealth, proving that their love is conditional on my bank account rather than genuine affection for who I am as a person. I worked as a janitor for 30 years while secretly owning the building and accumulating a fortune, conducting a test to see which members of my family would love me when they thought I was poor. And they all failed that test by mocking me and excluding me and being ashamed of honest work that they considered beneath them. Now they know the poor janitor they abandoned was worth $47 million, and they have realized too late that their cruelty and their obsession with social status has cost them an inheritance that could have changed their lives, but the money will go instead to young people who understand the value of hard work, who won't be ashamed of their parents' occupations, who deserve opportunities more than my family deserves my fortune.